I started recording.
Oh, shit. All right. Fine then. I guess I'm going. All right. So I see this issue in the audiophile community that's becoming more prevalent with this concept of Soundstage being a meme and only existing or really mattering. That's my issue, is the concept of it mattering for speakers. And that it doesn't matter for IEMs and for headphones, speaking about open back headphones specifically. And this misconception stems from a few things, but I think it primarily stems from a misunderstanding of what Soundstage is, a misunderstanding um, of what Soundstage can be, and a general tendency towards reductivism in the audiophile community. And that primary reductivism that I see, that reduction I see, is that Soundstage is width. This is more prominent with newer members to the audio community. Well, they could come in and ask, what are the widest sounding X, Y, and Z? But it's also an issue with fairly experienced to veteran individuals. Why do you matter about width? Might be a response that they have when someone asks a question like Soundstage. And I don't mean to straw man anyone here. I feel like I have the necessary experience from having to oversee a community and being a member of other communities to see what's going on. So the I've taken to, instead of saying sound stage, I say staging or stage presentation. And I would prefer not to do that, honestly. I would prefer to just use the word soundstage. But I know that if I just use the word soundstage, it's going to be misunderstood, or I'm going to have to go into a long diatribe of why it is misunderstood. So I've taken to using my own terms, and please, I don't think there's any need to use these terms going forward. It's just for the sake of some clarification purposes here, because there's a lot that gets missed in this specific realm of the hobby. So there are two primary things that people like to discuss in this hobby that fall into these categories, and those are soundstage and imaging. And these are seen as two separate things, when I think anyone that has any modicum of experience knows that they are tied together. The soundstage and imaging, so your ability to locate an element in a certain track or piece of music or entertainment, your ability to track that, how stark it stands out from everything else. And then we get more complicated, nebulous, nefarious terms like layering and other things that go on that really all come back to soundstage. If you understand what soundstage is and how it can be affected. The first thing that I want to establish very quickly is that soundstage is not width. It is the way I like to say it is the attributing of spatial phenomenon in the audio realm. So anything that has to do with a sense of space and any type of spatial relationship or declaration we make about something in audio has to do with soundstage. Um, and I'm going to stick mainly to this definition with saying in minimum phase or mostly minimum phase devices, because in a room, the room itself can have a stark effect on soundstage. So that's also a consideration. Have the reflections off the wall, but that's not what we're getting into here. So the first thing I want to get into is talking about spatial phenomena, is talking about the two ways um, that a mixing engineer can change locationality of an element within a mix. So the two mains ways. And the reason that I talk about this is if we dive a little bit deeper into soundstage, people start to talk about width, height, and depth. So our intermediate individuals that have had more time with it, or maybe those who are jumping straight into it, notice that there might be a sense of depth in the space that is there. So there there's an issue here where there is one of these that in a straightforward way a mixing engineer cannot affect, and that is height. um, and by that I mean a mixing engineer can do things to make something seem like they have a wider sound stage, but that's not what I mean. I mean the placement of things, the ability to affect where they are sitting on the sound stage, this invisible virtual illusory space in which the music sits. They can only do it in two dimensions. They can only do it horizontally and depthly. In other words, they can do X and or we could do X and Z, but we can't do Y. Where obviously Y in this instance is height. And why can we do that? Because we can do that because we have panning. So panning affects the horizontal axis, how far left or right. So if I have a signal and I have it dead center C, it's going to be directly in the center of the mix. So when we're talking about, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Or another option is, depending on the program or the soft pan, it might have L50, and that means I have it slammed all the way to the right. And then we might have R50. I have it slammed all the way. I got that backwards, all the way to the right. The other one is all the way to the left. My bad. So the point is when we are talking about width, what are we talking about? We're talking about how far apart L50 and R50 are. That's what typically soundstage is getting reduced to only one thing in the community, which is how far apart things are. And then the whole idea that soundstage itself is a meme in headphones or IEMs makes sense. They're not known for making something sound wide. They can't make it sound like it's being thrown a meter to your left and right because they're not speakers that are spread out a meter to your left and right. But there's a lot more to it than that, and that is where we get into the next stage. Is that the second thing, and there are a couple different ways that you can do this, but there is a direct way, and that's reverb. And reverb is the difference between a clap in a really damp or dampened room where you clap and it immediately goes away, or you clap into a cave and it is much like an echo effect. Because what reverb does, and I want to start out by saying panning is something that is pretty much always done in mixing. If it were not done, it would be a terrible mix for a song. Reverb is almost always done as well. And reverb creates the sense of depth and why, or how far back the thing goes. How far back the thing goes, or how far back does the thing start. So let's imagine, for our purposes, that we're saying that a soundstage has a depth that's from 0, which means it's right up in your face. The beginning of the stage is right up in your face, and we have 100, and that means we have an element that's sitting as far back as it can. So the issue with saying how deep it is is I might have something. So this right here stands for the total closeness and farness of a specific soundstage we are currently experiencing. Not in general. I'm not saying 100 is the largest possible. I'm saying that for whichever one we're listening to right now, let's say the HG 800, that's what it is. So on these headphones, it can appear 0 to 100. But how much 100 is depends on that thing again. How deep does it go? But we also have the issue is that what if we have something that instead of saying it goes from 0 to 100, what if something goes from 50 to 100? Right? So not only does it not start at the front, the closest the soundstage can be, it starts about halfway back into it and then extends back to the full depth of the soundstage. So to say what is the depth, we actually need to break that down into two things. How far back does an element go, but also how far back does that element start? And I'm going to get a little more into the relevance of this later, but I'm just making this up on the fly. So give me some leeway if it's not the best organization ever. Now, the reason reverb does that is that it's supposed to simulate like you're standing in a large space. So when someone shouts at you and it has echo and there's tons of times for things to come to your ears, it creates the sense of depth or something being far away. But there are some things that people don't know about reverb, which is that you can control many parameters of reverb when you're mixing. But let's just say that one of them is how long it lasts. And we're not going to say that like it sounds like a big cathedral hall, like the Halo theme song, versus a small living room. How long does that tail, that sustain, that decay, how long does it last? But there's another thing, which is how long after does that start? So there's something where you will hear a snare drum and the first 10 seconds of the snare drum has no reverb on it at all. And then after that, it has reverb. So that keeps the closeness of it, but then makes it seem like it's in a larger space. But I can make something seem underwater or very far away if I start the reverb at the exact same time or earlier towards it. 10 milliseconds would actually, honestly, probably have that effect. But the point is to say is that a mixing engineer can control how late into a particular element, a vocal, a snare, a synth that they want it to start, and they can also determine how long they want it to be, because reverb creates a sense of space, but particularly for our instances, depth. This gets more complex than this. I'm just trying to give the two simplest ways with while being reductive myself, but hopefully to reduce the reductivism that's currently going on. So then the question is what determines height? So I've asked this of a couple people and I've gotten some yes or no's, but I notice something when I listen to music and when I'm judging the sound stage, the stage that it puts out in front of my head or in my head, if we're talking IEMs, and the shape it has. And I notice that sometimes there are things that sound like they're higher or lower up. And there is no way to do this in mixing. There is no way to do this. We have two ears, we have stereo speakers. For 99% of the music, we don't mess with height. We don't say, hey, let's play more to this speaker that's up here than this speaker that's at the level of everything else. We don't do that. We don't, there is no tool in a stereo mixing box that will in any way affect height. So why is it that this hi-hat sounds higher? Why is it not, why do things not just sound wide and deep? Why do they also have a height to them? That's a good question. I have some ideas on that, but I don't like to speak on things that I don't know for certain. So I'm going to refrain on those ideas, other than to say that it has things to do with amplitude um, and frequency, and where that instrument might typically be if we were at a live performance. There's a lot that can go into it. So now that we got that we have width, height, and depth of a soundstage, there's a thing that tends to happen, which is that a soundstage will take shape. It will begin to fill in. I like to liken it to as we hear more elements. Okay, we hear something that's hard over here. Okay, we hear something that's hard over here. Okay, I hear the kick and the snare, and they seem to be right over here. My head is right here. That's my body, but we'll say it's just my head. So I have this idea of this shape, and this one would seem triangular. But now, what happens if this is really weak and this is really strong? Now, tell me, where in any of this discussion of soundstage did we hear about a weak center? Did that concept get brought up? What about side heavy presentation? No, none of those things got brought up, because there are a couple things that happen. Is that soundstage has a general shape to it that we can qualify just by, as things pick up, as we hear things in the music, we get to hear that, well, maybe this one has this shape of its deepest here, and there's not a lot of depth here, but there's more depth here, and generally it presents things triangular. But also notice that things started pretty far away from me. It's not like it started here. So that's a different way that a soundstage could present itself. Excuse my god awful doodling. So the fact is that there's more to it than we've discussed. So what we have shape, and then we have something that typically falls under this other idea of imaging, and much of this falls under this idea of imaging. But where's our issue with that we just saw? Is that, well, I noticed the locations of these things, and that helped me build what the shape of the stage is. So we already know that there's a strong interrelationship between soundstage. Let's throw out, maybe this soundstage seems extremely wide, which makes it seem like there is a lot more space in between elements in the music, which makes them stand out better. Let's take the example of the common perception of the Sennheiser HD 650 6XX, which is, it has 3 blob images. It has stuff. So let's go back and do this, because people know these things, but then they try to reduce it, or they haven't dug into it a little more, or it's just never occurred to them. And that's what I'm trying to kind of fix here. So that means is that while a listener is listening to it, let's say that they're happy, they just got their brand new HD6XX. What they're going to notice is that they're going to notice things are really strong over here, and then they're kind of like weak here, and then they're really strong right here, and then they're weak here, and then they're really strong right here. Where in our previous discussion of soundstage do we have that? Well, we're saying that this has weak imaging here, right? So we have this weak intermediary thing. And from personal anecdotal experience, I don't know the reason why, but I've also seen something similar to this with Odyssey, with like the LCDX, in that we have this, it's not as bad on it, but we have this dead zone in this area where things just get weaker. Why? It's tied to frequency response, but and perception of the thing, but I can't tell you why, but I can tell you that that is something that is worthy of discussion, and this might be as well. So,
Huh.
imaging has a relationship to that. There is a shape that we can say to it, and there is also a strength of things. But not only that, is that there can also be a size of things, and sometimes strength and size kind of go hand in hand. So, what I'll do for that one is I will refer to the Odyssey LCD5. The Odyssey LCD5, in my impressions in Audio Serious on IEF, I note that it has a bow tie shaped soundstage. Why do I describe that? Well, I can be a little bit self-reflective and notice some things, and it's honestly a bit more drastic. It's a bit more drastic. I notice when I listen to music that as elements move this way, they begin to sound bigger, which makes it sound seem bow tie like, because they're larger over here and smaller here. And it might have a depth that looks something like this. I don't know. I don't recall. I noticed it didn't seem particularly deep in here. So we can talk about the size of elements themselves as a whole in the soundstage. We can talk about the size across the soundstage and where an element is appearing, and we can talk about the shape of these things as well. So one of my big beefs with open back headphones is that they have a weak center image. The center image is remarkably weak, but it's primarily not so much that the center is weak, but that it's, I like to say, a side heavy presentation. It sounds like a lot more things are moved to the left or right or panned, like I discussed, more towards there. They're clumped over here, and things sound louder on the side, and the center is weak. And we can, could you mute yourself for just like the next few minutes? So where was the next thing I was going to go with that? So let's talk about why some of these things occur and why I feel like these misconceptions evolved. And it's because it's something that really never needs to be considered by someone that only comes from IEMs, which a lot of IEF in its beginning started out like, and a lot of people that haven't listened to speakers for a long time. But I'm going to give a very incorrect but simplistic version of Soundstage. I'm not going to go into more complex things that affect it, but I'm going to do that. Let's say that we have a typical monopole speaker, and it is pointing into one ear like this on this side, one ear to this on this side. A thing that can often be experienced is that the soundstage is shaped like this, but it also has an x-axis or y-axis. There's a height to it. How tall are the images in general in this soundstage? Are things above or below? Though that phenomenon doesn't seem to happen as much in speakers. And you notice here that I have a left and a right, and I have an up and a down. But more than that, it can be a little bit left and down and over here and over here and over here and over here. And typically my main things without reverb are going to seem kind of front and center. They're going to sit right in the center, and they're going to be my kick drum, my snare, and those are going to be the things that seem most present and prominent because both ears are getting them. And through this process, we form some type of stage in front of us. And I'm not going to go into this much further because this is already a terrible representation. My entire point with this is just to say that if someone asks for headphones for a good sound stage, that means nothing. For a couple reasons. One, we don't know what they mean by soundstage, and two, we don't know if that would equal good to them. So I always come back to the HD800 because those, for me, I care about soundstage, obviously, in things that aren't just headphones and IEMs. And that's because I only use headphones when I have to. I would rather use speakers. I only use IEMs when I have to. So my goal is to get as speaker-like a general presentation of the stage as possible. And what I've noticed quite often is that we have this very common issue of where open backs in particular have a very weak center and very side heavy presentation, and I couldn't stand that. And I noticed it with dozens of headphones that I have demoed and tried. Primarily, it's a phenomenon on open backs. You don't see it in IEMs or closed backs as much because generally there's a stronger center image for reasons. So for me, if I get recommended a headphone and it had a weak center image, it would be terrible. So why do I like the HD800? And it's not because they're particularly noted for a strong center image, but it's particularly noted because let's go back to our handy paint pal here. Imagine what that one I drew earlier, where the furthest sounds sound like they're right here, and then the center might sound like it's like right in here, something like this. Well, the HD800, it doesn't sound like it's right next to my head, and it shouldn't, because speakers are in front of me and propagating out images. So some people say that the HD800 sounds too diffuse or things sound too far away, and it's like, no, instead of left sounding all the way over here, it sounds over here. And right, instead of being all the way over here, it's over here. And then you have the sound stage that begins from there, instead of starting like it's directly to the side of my head, which is not in any way like how music comes across rather on speakers, or how it's typically mixed, which is speakers, though its translations are worked for on headphones. So this is why that's also important. Another reason would be that I could not stand not having a whole lot of portions where it's weak in here, but it's strong here, here, and here. I couldn't tolerate that. So one thing that I want you to do to challenge yourself is I have EQ'd hundreds. I've made hundreds upon hundreds of EQ profiles by this point, and I've tried hundreds on my own gear that I have. And I want you to do something. I want you to listen to your IEM or your headphone stock, and then I want you to tune it to Harman. And I want you to tell me, why does Kirka say that Harman sounds triangular? And listen and see if you can note that difference from the way it is stock. Or, for example, most people that know me know that I care about studio neutral, that it sounds as close as possible as my reference tracks in a well-treated studio that I am accustomed to. Why then are there a couple exceptions where I will actually take something that is not neutral for other reasons or for other priorities. And there are only a couple instances of that. And one of those instances is the existence of the Sony IER M9. And that's because the IER M9 casts a soundstage that is much like this. It's like I'm here looking at a curved rectangular window. Um, so, in other words, I would say that the soundstage presentation for the M9 is greater than Harman in IEMs. In other words, I would say just due to the nature that it's not like a speaker where I'm not getting. So when I have two speakers pointed in, despite the fact, wow, this is terrible. Despite the fact that I have a left here and a right pointed here, still some of these sounds are getting into this ear and some of these sides are getting into this ear. So should we change our frequency response to change how the soundstage is produced in IEMs or headphones to have something that's actually better for that form factor? And in doing so, we would arguably have to sacrifice the same tonal response or predicted tonal response of translating in-room good speakers to IEMs or headphones. So I would take this soundstage any day of the week because it seems better than this clunky soundstage that I get from Harman. And I would take this soundstage of the HD 800 any day of the week over this one, the HD 650. Because there's a lot more to soundstage, and that's why I would say stage presentation. How does the stage present itself to me, and all the aspects of that? Is the stage of a whole shaped like X, Y, or Z? Is it strong or weak in the center or the sides? How large are the images as they move across the soundstage instead of just where are they? And what shape do they make when they're moving across the soundstage? What shape can I perceive? So there's a lot more to soundstage than is frequently discussed. So I likely could have made this much better, much clearer, and much more organized, but we just decided to make this right now because people had asked for it a few times and the topic keeps coming up. So there you go. And if you have any questions, let me know. What does Kryn say? Fuck off?
Yeah, fuck off.